kind of like a logical disconnect between the stories, the competing stories that your team is using to attack President Trump. On the one hand, you're saying that the countries are really angry and they're going to have to retaliate. On the other hand, you're saying that consumers are going to bear the costs and it's going to drive inflation up. But if U.S. consumers are bearing the costs, there's no reason for the countries to be angry. So the fact is the countries are angry and retaliating. And by the way, coming to the table, I got a report from the USTR last night that more than 50 countries have reached out to the president to begin a negotiation. But they're doing that because they understand that they bear a lot of the tariff. And so I don't think that you're going to see a big effect on the consumer in the U.S. because I do think that the reason why we have a persistent long-run trade deficit is these people have very inelastic supply. They've been dumping goods. Well, there might be some increase in prices, but the fact is that if there were going to be a heavy burden on the U.S. consumer, then this trade deficit that for 30 years we've seen really since China entered the WTO would be something that would have gone down. It would have gone down over time. It would have responded to the prices. The bottom line is that China entered the WTO in 2000. In the 15 years that followed, real incomes declined about $1,200 cumulatively over that time. And so if cheap goods were the answer, if cheap goods were going to make Americans' real wages, real welfare better off, then real incomes would have gone up over that time. Instead, they went down because wages went down more than prices went down. So we got the cheap goods at the grocery store, but then we had fewer jobs. And that's why President Obama and Chuck Schumer and Nancy Pelosi and President Trump have come out saying we've got to come up with a better policy, a policy that treats our workers fairly compared to everybody else. And now President Trump, true to his word, just like he promised during the campaign, just like he put into his campaign platform, he's delivering on his word.
Right.
The independence of the Fed.
So
but the president's allowed to have an opinion. Absolutely, the president's allowed to have an opinion. But there's not going to be any political coercion over the Fed, for sure.
So you said the president's allowed to have an opinion. Is that his opinion or not?
He's not trying to take the market. He's trying to deliver for American workers. And I mean, what would you have him do? Again, real wages down 15 years in a row under the previous policy, and that's why Americans voted for him. They brought him in to turn the economy around for the American worker, and that's what he's focused on. It is not a strategy for the markets to crash. It's a strategy to create a golden age in America for the American worker. That's his strategy. The data, we just got the data for last month and the month before. Both times manufacturing employment went up and auto employment went up. And again, we're looking at about 10,000 auto jobs, George. That's more than we got all of last year with Joe Biden. This week, they're starting to ramp up in anticipation of that. I would expect that the jobs numbers, and I'll come back and talk to you about it when they come out, are going to go up by even more now that the tariffs are in place. Just saw that the Senate has agreed to budget rules that the House is negotiating with them now that is going to give the biggest tax cut in history in order to make space for these policies and to not have the runaway deficits that gave us all the inflation in the Biden administration. Then we've got an all-of-the-above approach where we're reducing taxes, reducing spending, reducing regulation, and imposing a baseline tariff around the world and hitting the harder actors, the tougher actors harder. That's what President Trump campaigned on. It's a sound policy. It's why people voted him into office, and it's what we're doing right now. We're delivering out the promises. A tariff is a form of tax. It's a way that you collect revenue when you import products, yes, to see supply and demand. And again, if you thought consumers are going to pay that tax, then you should be puzzled about why it is that countries are upset about it.
Well,
there's obviously an ongoing negotiation with Russia and Ukraine, and I think the president made the decision not to conflate the two issues. It doesn't mean that Russia, the fullest of time, is going to be treated wildly different than every other country. And we've seen inflation coming down. I think inflation comes from runaway spending that is monetized by the Fed. That's what Jay Powell and Joe Biden gave us last term. And then I saw the Fed kind of saw the error in its ways after a while and started to tighten and help get in control under inflation. And what we're seeing now on the Hill is reduced spending. And so I don't think that the inflationary spiral that we saw last term is a high risk right now.